Marvel Snap just announced their series drops for April, and I have a deck for each of the cards that is dropping a series. Let's jump into it. First up on the list is Super Skrull. Super Skrull is not a card I ever really recommend you buying. He's best suited as a tech option, which is to say you bring him in when you expect a lot of a certain card that he is good against. So an example of this would be you could play him in Patriot to beat Patriot Mirrors if that's what you were interested. Here, we have him in a Devil Dinosaur deck to beat Devil Dinosaur and Darkhawk Mirrors. That's the idea. With this one, he also sees a little bit of extra benefit for being paired with Zabu here, costing a little bit less. You'll notice there's a cable in here. You don't need cable to play this. I wanted to play cable. I got nothing for you. Next on the list is Bast. Bast is actually a great card to be downgrading. There are a ton of things you can do with Bast, ranging from Mr. Negative decks to the deck that you see right here, which is a bounce deck with Hitmonkey. Now, one thing that sticks out about this list is that there's no Falcon in it, and I find that the Hitmonkey Bast lists tend to have a little bit of inbuilt tension. So, for example, you could actually cut Hitmonkey from this list and run Falcon if you were interested in just maximizing pure power as opposed to the flexibility that Hitmonkey can afford you on later turns. Especially given that you're an Iron Man deck, I do have a little bit of suspicion as to whether the Hitmonkey is even good in here. So I definitely would say you can take Hitmonkey, replace it with Falcon if you did not buy the season pass, and frankly, even if you did, it might be a better deck even without it. The reason I don't want to replace Mystique, Darkhawk, and Iron Man is because I feel like they all sort of go together and make each of those cards make the other ones better. The fact that you have Darkhawk as an alternate target for Mystique is really good. The fact that you can threaten to play two Iron Men is just an unbelievably powerful thing to do, and frankly, I think that package might actually be a little bit more important than the Hitmonkey, so you could definitely just run run Falcon instead of Hitmonkey here, if that's something you wanted to do. Now, one other place to look at modifying the deck is potentially taking out Bishop. I personally have enjoyed Bishop a ton, but that is sort of, you are sort of getting overloaded on guys that go big when you have Angela, Bishop, Hitmonkey, and Darkhawk. So the part of the thinking between Hitmonkey might not be so good in here is that all the other ones work retroactively, which means that you don't need to be, you can just have them on the board and they will get the power regardless. Whereas with Hitmonkey, it sort of conflicts with your play Iron Man, play Mystique next turn lines, because there aren't going to be too many other cards you can play along with Hitmonkey there unless you hit them with a beast. Definitely an archetype that needs some experimentation before we arrive at the optimal list, but I think we're pretty close here, like maybe 10 or 11 out of 12. I do think, gun to my head, I would take Falcon over Hitmonkey in this archetype right now. I'm very open to being wrong, though. And as far as Bast is concerned, she brings the entire deck together. She is good with every single card in this deck. Just an unbelievable unit of a card. Enormous fan of Bast generally. One thing you'll notice is not in this deck is America Chavez, who I am a huge fan of in this archetype, but I can't seem to fit her in the version that wants to play Iron Man into Mystique, because that version really wants to have a chance at top decking Mystique on turn 6 if you played the Iron Man. Other than that, I think this is a very straightforward deck to look at, but a very difficult deck to play. Something that's definitely going to reward you for putting reps in. Next up is Shuri, who is downgrading to Series 3, probably right in time to get nerfed. Yikes. But right now, this is the best Shuri deck that I am aware of. We have simply swapped out Iceman, or swapped in Iceman for Sunspot. Sunspot was just very not good when we played this deck. It was not a really compelling unit. The fact that it no longer actually impacts the board when it comes down, so you can't go Sunspot on 1, 2-drop on 2, and actually have power at 2 places on the board, it does kind of matter. That same kind of nerf, where it just no longer affects the board at all, made Angela go from one of the most played 2-cost cards in the entire game to one of the least. And I think people underestimate just how big a 1-power drop is when the unit you're talking about only gets to like 5 or so a lot of the time. Now, Sunspot is still very good in the specific case of you are soaking mana on 5 for She-Hulk, but other than that, he was just not good at all in this list post-nerf. I do think the Iceman is pretty helpful. You can, You can hit things in your opponent's Shuri mirrors. You can just generally get a little bit of upside, and he's just, he's a good unit. Another option here would be Nightcrawler, I think, if you were interested in just moving around just a couple power, that could be relevant as well. I think either of those would be plausible. I've gone for Iceman here because I don't want to be relying on my 1-drop to stick on the board when Killmonger is still a card that you are liable to see. So I wanted to play a 1-drop that got the value as you played it. That said, you do have armor to protect a Nightcrawler if you absolutely need to. Just, I preferred the one that got the value when you played it. Next up is a Black Panther list. Now, this list is a typical on-reveal list that has the sort of side grade plan of Wong into Black Panther into Arnim Zola, and that creates just these very large Black Panthers that are very difficult to deal with. A lot of what this deck does is actually extremely powerful. The reason it's sort of not played very much right now, well, I guess there's a couple reasons. The first is it's very vulnerable to Cosmo and very telegraphed. So you play a Wong, they put a Cosmo in your Wong lane, you're like, oh, well, there goes my game. And the other bit of that is that when you have the good cards, normally you want to have the good cards and snap, but because your counterplay is so obvious, if you snap on a Wong and they snap back and Cosmo you, you're going to lose a bunch of cubes. Basically, what it does is it creates a scenario where a lot of your good draws are actually dangerous to snap on for you. Now, the upside is if they don't have the counter cards, and this can be, Wong or Arrow moving your stuff off, or Magneto pulling your Cosmo, Arrow moving your stuff off, Magneto pulling your Wong. There's a bunch of stuff that's good into you, but if they don't have it, you actually do have kind of a higher power ceiling than most other decks in the format. I'm not saying this is the time for Wong to come back, but it's possible that if we start seeing less Cosmo, a deck like this is genuinely threatening. The other issue it has is everyone sort of knows what your range is when you play a deck like this. And by that, I mean, like, when you play Wong and Snap, they know they can expect either a big Black Panther, a lot of White Tigers, and depending on how you set up your lane earlier, maybe you, like, Odin into an infinite amount of Ironheart triggers, right? Like, this is not a deck that has a lot of hidden information, and it's also not a deck that has a ton of ways to interact with your opponent. It just does what it does, and if they're not ready for it, they will lose. That said, it does have some significant downsides in terms of high cube losses, in my experience, but it is a great place to play Black Panther if you want to make a giant Black Panther. If that is the thing you are interested in and you want to have it in a relatively decent shell, this is the shell. So for Valkyrie, we're featuring a Bastriot deck. Unfortunately, Bast is also in this list, but this is, outside of the Thanos Valkyrie lists, probably my favorite Valkyrie deck right now. And it just leverages all sorts of tricks to make her extremely powerful. Like, obviously, you can put her in a lane with the hood, and suddenly he gets like +5, right? Because he starts at -2. You have a Wasp to go along with her in lanes late, and the Wasp also gets buffs with Patriot. You have the Squirrel Girl, which can put stuff in the Valkyrie lane. You have a lot of ways to put a lot of units on the board and capitalize on them with Valkyrie. And then you win the Valkyrie lanes with buffs from Blue Marvel, with buffs from Patriot, with the fact that a Bishop is in there, with an Iron Man. She's a lane winner in this deck. And this deck is straight up. It's a good deck. A deck version of this without Bast in it actually won a tournament just a little bit ago. And the only reason they weren't running Bast in it is because they didn't have her at the time. This is a deck that works. It is a very functional and playable deck, definitely a good take on the Patriot archetype, and it leverages Valkyrie in a very powerful way, in my opinion, in order to lock down lanes in ways that are not usually expected from a deck that is playing Patriot. It's a very powerful turn 6 play. It's a very good card. You do have a little bit of like, okay, well, if they played a Cosmo in their Red Skull lane, then you sort of have to manage priority there so that you hit the thing they Taskmaster with the Valkyrie. Like, there's a lot of play in this deck, is how I would describe it. There's a lot to think about when you play it, especially in terms of managing your own board space early. You don't want to super clog yourself up, but you do want to have multiple options for where you play the Valkyrie late because you don't want them to know where it's going to go. So there is this interesting tension here. I don't even know if tension is the right word to describe it. It is just how the deck plays, and it's very fun to manage, in my opinion. Next up, let's take a look at Modoc, who is dropping from Series 5 to Series 4. In my opinion, Modoc is one of the very, very best cards for the discard archetype, but unfortunately for him, he does not really go out of that lane very much. So a lot of Modoc decks you're going to see are just going to be like, it's that. It's that. You're going to be playing that and like maybe a couple cards different, depending on how you want to do it. Modoc decks are built around playing Modoc on either 5 or 6, depending on if you drew Dracula and if you have like a swarm in your hand or not. So basically the idea is the base play pattern is you play some dudes, you play a Dracula, you play a Modoc, Apocalypse goes back to your hand, a couple swarms go back to your hand, your final turn is playing America Chavez and a couple swarms, discarding Apocalypse to the Dracula. That's what you do. And honestly, it's a better deck than people give it credit for. This is an actual archetype that if you mess around with the tech slots enough, you'll be able to find a way to combat things in the metagame. The issues it has tend to be things like, well, okay, if they have priority and they leech you on turn 5 when you Modoc, you're dead. And you also tend to be only doing one thing a lot of these games. You are putting points on the board. You'll notice we don't have things like Shang-Chi. The things we've gone for in terms of interaction are pretty small ball, with the exception of Storm, who is very good in this list. Like you go Storm into Dracula, or you have Morbius into Storm. Either of those is totally good here. Like, this is great. One thing I did do is a lot of these earlier lists ran Sunspot instead of Nightcrawler. I'm very out on Sunspot right now, especially in a deck that has as many abilities to play, you know, a card on turn 3 and a card on turn 4 and a card on turn 5 as this one. So I have gone for Nightcrawler just for a little bit of additional Storm insurance. So if you have to play a fair game, maybe we can get some stuff over there into the Nightcrawler. That said, I do wonder if the Storm isn't a little bit underpowered right now in the context of there's a lot of Doctor Dooms running around, and you have to be aware of Doctor Doom when you play for the Storm game plan in this deck. You absolutely do. And so what this does is create this really awkward situation where you kind of have to figure out after you play Storm. Let's say you go Morbius into Storm. Normally I'm like, all right, yeah, fine, we're good. But let's say you don't have Morbius, you just have a Storm, and then it's like, all right, do we have to commit the Dracula there? Or can we make a different play and commit the Dracula to winning another lane and try to bluff them into thinking we're going to put the Dracula there so they don't even go there? Like, there's a bunch of awkward, not necessarily awkward, just a bunch of, well, if I do this, they do this kind of plays revolving around the Storm in this list. As far as Modoc, I mean, he's the deck. He is the deck. Modoc is what this list is built to do. You play Modoc, you do all the things that Modoc lets you do. A lot of playing this deck is like, man, I really want to draw Modoc right now. He is the best card in this deck. He's outstanding, and I'm not saying he's 100% worth of 3,000 tokens, because he pretty much only goes in this list, but if you want to play discard, you kind of do need him, in my opinion. Next up, Stature. So this is a very speculative list. I am addicted to putting Stature and Black Bolt in good cards lists. And you'll notice this one is based a little bit on the Freddy Babes list with the, you know, Swarm Colleen Wing, and then you have the Moon Knight. Maybe that also hits a Swarm. You just play for priority. It's definitely a list that is a little bit clunky. I used to play versions of this where the idea was we don't even run Swarm and Colleen Wing, we don't even run Moon Knight, you just play Black Bolt Stature as good cards. I think that is potentially a better way to take this. But I did want to highlight, like, hey, you know, you can also do this stuff if you're really interested in playing Stature and making sure she's good. This kind of priority shell can go for it. The problem is there isn't a lot of upside for priority shells right now. So another way you could take Stature would be you could try it with the Moon Girl kind of things in a Shuri list. So a list like that, for example, top 8'd my Best of the Besties tournament. And I think that's probably the most viable way to play Stature. I just didn't want to highlight yet another Shuri deck in this list. I wanted to show a version of this without Shuri. But if you wanted to play that specifically, here's what it would look like. This is directly from the guy who top 8'd my tournament with it. This is kind of what I think the most viable version of it would look like. You'll notice that Unlike other lists, it's not reliant on Shuri necessarily to show up. You just happen to have it as a game plan, but it's more like you're doing a lot more small ball stuff here. I really do like this list. It does also run Sauron. It is a little bit pricey. It's why I didn't want to highlight it, but you should know about it if you're looking for a place to play Stature and you just happen to have a lot of the other cards in it. This is definitely a list that works. It's especially good, in my opinion, on ladder, where the America Chavez, which the fact that we don't have Taskmaster and do have America Chavez makes us pretty bad into other Shuri decks, in my opinion. It is still very, very good into non-Shuri matchups because we are more likely to draw the Shuri. We are more likely to draw the Sauron. Like, these are cards that we want to be playing on curve, and the fact that people don't expect us to go like Sauron into Shuri into, wait, that's a Black Bolt with 16 power and then like an Ebony Maw and a Stature on the last turn? What's going on here? Like, that kind of stuff is really valuable on ladder. If you're doing things that they're not going to play around, it's usually pretty good. This is a list that does a lot of things that they're not going to play around. It seems like a very solid list for ladder if you want to play Stature. Finally, we have Ghost, and this is my recommended Ghost list. Go nuts. As always, y'all, this has been KM Best. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Remember, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Make my dopamine receptors go burr. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.